Of course, we'll keep you up to date with it all day on the BBC. It is now 20 minutes to 9, 30 years to today. 30 years ago, Terry Waite, the Archbishop of Canterbury's envoy to the Middle East, he was released from captivity in Beirut.
He was held for almost 5 years after being kidnapped there and spent much of that time in solitary confinement and chained to a radiator. He was beaten, he was mocked, a kind of mock execution he was subjected to. Alice Key has been looking back at that story.
This was the moment Terry Waite returned home in 1991.
The presence here today of so many people is indicative not only of your concern for Western hostages, but your concern for justice, for peace, and for truth throughout the world.
After 5 years of being held hostage in the Lebanese capital of Beirut by Islamic fundamentalists, he was freed on the 18th of November. The church envoy travelled to the war-torn country in 1987 to negotiate the release of several British prisoners, including journalist John McCarthy. But despite early success, he was eventually taken hostage himself. After years in solitary confinement, being chained to a radiator, beaten and subject to mock executions, his captors eventually released him after 1,763 long, torturous days. And in the 30 years since his release, he's devoted his life to humanitarian causes. Alice Key, BBC News.
Well, Terry Waite joins us now, live on Breakfast. Good morning to you. Thanks for being with us,
Good
Terry.
morning, John. Yeah, good morning.
30 years, goodness me. How does that feel to you when you look back to that time 3 decades ago?
Well, I can hardly believe it's 30 years since I was released. I just heard that clip and, my mind goes back to that day in Lynham, which was a rainy, blowy, windy day. And I descended into that airport and was greeted by hundreds of press people. And I made that little speech, which I actually put together on the aeroplane. And that was my signing off. I said, right, I'm going to make one statement and then retreat for a while, which I did. And seems a long time ago now, but the time has gone very quickly. And many good things have happened since that day.
It's interesting you talking about coming back and giving a speech and all the cameras at Lynham. I mean, if something like this happened now, I bet it wouldn't be so public. You'd be sort of kept away from publicity for a while. They'd be thinking about your mental health more. I know you got support, but I imagine it'd be a very different scenario.
Yes, I think we've learned a lot since those days. I mean, one of the things that I've done since being released is found an organization called Hostage International, which now we work all over the world, and we work with returning hostages. We're an independent charity. We work in close cooperation, of course, with the Foreign Office, but we give advice to people, and our advice is that when you come out, yes, certainly make a statement, but then get away and give yourself time. Some people don't realize that it really does take time to readjust to life after you've been through a significant period of difficulty in your life.
1,763 days you were held for, much of it in solitary confinement. What kept you going? Because your strength when you did emerge, when you went public and were seen by the cameras, you looked remarkably together and well. What motivated you? What kept you so together?
Well, the conditions, as you've described them, were pretty grim. I mean, I was chained to the wall for 23 hours and 50 minutes a day. I slept on the floor. I didn't have any books or papers. I was in a room where metal shutters were in front of the window if I was in an upstairs room. So no natural light came in. And of course, there was no companionship and no books and papers. So it was a fairly austere existence, a little bit worse than lockdown. And what you have to do in a situation like that is, first of all, you have to be able to maintain some degree of hope within yourself. Secondly, I recognise that I still had life, and although it was very limited, I could still was able to live as fully as possible within the day as it dawned. Live one day at a time, in other words, and keep your mind alive. That's the critical bit. I was able to write in my head. I wrote many stories, and I wrote my first book in my head during those years, which I put on paper later on when I came out. And so it was by keeping my mind alive, by keeping hope alive. There's one very little story about that. In this dark room, it was very difficult to tell whether it was day or night. But when the sun rose, there was a chink in the shutter on the window, and a little beam of light came through. And gradually that light, illuminated the room. I used to say to myself, don't give up. Remember, light is stronger than darkness. And somehow I was able to maintain hope in that situation.
A little bit worse than lockdown. That just about puts it into perspective, Terry, for all of us. Goodness me. At the beginning of this week, we were talking, of course, about Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe in Iran still being held, and her husband who's just ended his hunger strike. It must sadden you enormously that 30 years after your release, there are still British citizens around the world in similar kinds of situations.
There are many, many. I could say, but without going into any detail, I'm in touch with Nazarin, who is bearing up remarkably well, although longing, of course, to be back with her family, as she should be, and with Richard and her daughter. Yes, we're in touch with them all the time. I mean, Hostage International has played a really remarkable role in aiding and supporting people from all over the world. We have a team of volunteers, former hostages and other helpers who work with us. And we entirely rely on public donations, one or two small grants. But it's been something that's really been useful. And I'm very glad that this has been one of the positive outcomes of my incarceration, along with also work with the homeless. I'll tell you one thing. What happened to me in those years, I've always had sympathy for people who have been on the margins of life, the homeless, the prisoner, the captive. And I've always had that for some reason or other. But during captivity, that sympathy was changed to empathy. Sympathy is to feel sorry for. Empathy is to know what it's like to have nothing, to be kicked around, to be treated as worthless. And that was one of the gifts that I got from that experience.
Terry Waite, thank you so much for joining us this morning, 30 years on, for sharing your stories and sharing your positivity. We appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, John.
Lovely man.
Yeah.
Especially after all those experiences. Now, after raising millions of pounds for motor neurone disease by